Right now, a clear fluid is rising and falling around your brain and spinal cord in a slow, steady rhythm. Pause, your body replaces this fluid completely, roughly 4 or 5 times over in a single day. And most people go their entire lives without ever hearing the system that moves it named out loud, despite it running uninterrupted since before they were born. Curious yogic tradition, centuries before anyone could see this fluid directly, had already given it a name of its own: Amrita, the nectar of immortality. The fluid itself is called cerebrospinal fluid, usually shortened to CSF, a clear, watery liquid produced deep inside the brain by a specialized tissue called the choroid plexus. Thoughtful. From there, it flows through a series of connected chambers called ventricles, four of them in total, each one draining into the next through narrow passages, before spilling out to bathe the entire surface of the brain and spinal cord and eventually draining back into the bloodstream to begin the cycle again. An adult carries only about 150 milliliters of it at any given moment, less than a cup, and yet the body manufactures roughly 3 to 4 times that amount fresh. Hey, every single day. Meaning the fluid surrounding your brain right now is entirely different from the fluid that was there this time yesterday. Softly, what does it actually do while circulating? Cushioning for one. Your brain effectively floats inside this fluid, its true weight reduced by something close to 9%, protected from the full force of ordinary movement, every step, every turn of the head. Without it, the brain's own weight pressing down on itself would be enough to damage delicate tissue at its base. The fluid isn't a luxury, it's load bearing. It also carries nutrients in, distributing glucose and other essentials to tissue that has no direct access to the bloodstream in a way most organs do. And this part turned out to matter far more than anyone expected, carries waste back out. Dramatic tone for most of medical history, that waste clearance role was assumed to be minor, a secondary function riding along behind the more obviously important jobs of cushioning and nutrient delivery. Then, in 2012, a researcher named Mike Nergard, working at the University of Rochester, published findings that reframed the entire system. Her team discovered a network of microscopic channels running alongside the brain's blood vessels, channels that allow cerebrospinal fluid to wash directly through brain tissue itself, flushing out metabolic waste products in the process, including proteins associated in excess with neurodegenerative disease. Curious Neriergaard named this newly mapped system the glymphatic system, a deliberate blend of glial, referring to the support cells that help run it, and lymphatic, the body's other major drainage network, since the whole arrangement functions as a kind of sewage system for the brain that nobody had properly mapped before. Researchers sometimes describe cerebrospinal fluid, taken together with this glymphatic drainage, as the body's third circulation, blood moving one way, lymph moving another, and this quieter, slower fluid moving through the brain and spine in a rhythm almost nobody consciously notices. Thoughtful. Here's the detail that made headlines when her research first came out, and it matters for everything that follows. This entire washing system runs dramatically more active during sleep. Brain cells appear to shrink slightly during deep sleep, widening the channels between them, letting far more fluid move through than during waking hours. Skip enough sleep and you're not simply missing rest. You're missing a nightly cleaning cycle your brain apparently can't fully complete any other way. Some of the proteins this system helps clear away are the same ones researchers studying Alzheimer's disease have spent decades trying to understand, which is part of why Nedergaard's discovery generated as much attention as it did, a plausible physical mechanism connecting ordinary sleep loss to long-term brain health in a way nobody had mapped quite this clearly before. Curious, long before any of this had a name, ancient yogic texts had already built an entire practice around fluid, gravity, and the top of the head. In the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, A 15th century manual on yogic practice, a technique called Khechari Mudra is described in striking physical detail. Softly, the practitioner is instructed to curl the tongue backward, up and behind the soft palate toward the upper nasal cavity, a position that, with years of gradual practice, some practitioners work to sustain for extended periods. Some traditional accounts describe a preparatory process stretched over months of gently working the tongue's underlying tissue to gain the flexibility the full posture requires, a detail that underlines how seriously the practice was taken rather than treated as a casual gesture. The stated purpose, according to the text, is to intercept a nectar the tradition calls Amrita, said to drip down from a subtle center near the crown of the head and to prevent it from being lost, or in the language of the text, burned away before it can nourish the rest of the body. Dramatic tone, the text is explicit that failing to preserve this nectar contributes to aging and decay. Preserving it, according to same text, is connected directly to vitality and, in its most exalted language, to freedom from death itself. Other Hatha Yoga texts describe similar ideas using slightly different language, but the core claim repeats across several of them. Something valuable flows downward from the region of the head, and disciplined practice exists specifically to keep as much of it as possible from being lost along the way. Curious, it would be easy and dishonest to claim the authors of this 15th century text were describing cerebrospinal fluid with anatomical precision. Thoughtful, they weren't, and they had no way to be. There was no concept of a choroid plexus, no ventricular system mapped on paper, nothing resembling the glymphatic system Nedergaard's lab would describe more than 500 years later. Size is tempting, watching a channel like this one, to round the resemblance up into clean prophecy fulfilled, and that temptation is worth naming honestly rather than giving to it. What the text does describe in its own language is strikingly specific all the same. A fluid associated with vitality and long life, originating near the top of the head, traveling downward through the central axis of the body, capable of being wasted or preserved depending on the practitioner's discipline. Or whether that counts as genuine anatomical insight or a remarkably fortunate metaphor is a question this video can't settle. What's fair to say is that the general picture, a vital fluid centered on the head, flowing down the spine, worth protecting, sits closer to modern anatomy than most ancient physiological claims managed to land. Softly, Western science took its own long path to the same fluid, and much of the delay came down to a simple technical problem. The Italian anatomist Domenico Cotugno provided the first detailed scientific description of cerebrospinal fluid in 1764, having noticed during dissections that the fluid tended to drain away before earlier anatomists ever got a proper look at it. Bodies were typically drained and preserved before dissection began, and the very fluid Cotugno eventually documented had usually already leaked out by the time anyone was looking closely enough to notice it was missing. It took a researcher willing to work with fresher tissue and to ask why certain cavities looked emptier than expected to finally document what generations before him had almost certainly seen and dismissed as nothing more than the ordinary mess of dissection. Curious, here's the counterintuitive part, and is the piece most people never think to ask about. Blood has an obvious pump behind it. Your heart contracts roughly once a second, driving circulation through sheer mechanical force. Thoughtful, cerebrospinal fluid has no equivalent dedicated pump. Its movement instead depends on a mix of gentler forces, the pulsing of nearby arteries, the rhythm of your breath, the subtle expansion and contraction of the skull and spine with each heartbeat, and it turns out your posture and your movement throughout the day. Some research, largely from animal studies so far, suggests that sleeping position may influence how efficiently this fluid clears waste overnight, with certain positions appearing to support better drainage than others in these early studies. Curious, human research on this specific question remains limited, And nobody should treat sleep position as a solved medical prescription based on results gathered mostly in laboratory rodents. But the broader principle is far better supported and doesn't depend on any single contested study. A body that moves gently and regularly tends to keep this fluid moving too, and a body held rigidly still tends not to, softly. So here's a short practice for tonight, built around exactly that principle. Come onto your hands and knees, wrists beneath your shoulders, knees beneath your hips. Inhales deeply. On an inhale, drop your belly gently toward the floor, lift your chest and tailbone, and let your gaze rise softly upward. This is sometimes called cow pose. Exhales. On the exhale, round your spine upward toward the ceiling, tucking your chin gently toward your chest, hollowing your belly. This is cat pose. Pause moves slowly between the two, breath leading the motion rather than the other way around, for 8 to 10 full rounds. Mali. Notice the wave traveling the length of your spine with each transition, neck, upper back, lower back, and back again. Unlike the standing spinal roll from other practices on this channel, this version keeps you low and supported, closer to the ground, closer to the fluid you're actually trying to move. Whispers when you finish. Come to stillness on your hands and knees for a few breaths, feeling whatever settling happens on its own. Long pause tonight. When you finally lie down to sleep, take one unhurried moment before you drift off to notice which way you're lying. Not to force a change, just to notice. Since somewhere close to that position, a fluid the yogis once called nectar is about to spend the next several hours doing its quietest, least celebrated work, clearing away, cell by cell, whatever the day left behind. Thoughtful right now, a clear fluid is rising and falling around your brain and spinal cord in a slow, steady rhythm. Pause tonight. It will do that work mostly while you sleep, mostly unnoticed, exactly the way it has for as long as you had a spine. The nectar the old texts warned you not to waste, quietly circulating whether or not you ever think to thank it.